Larry, if you could hear me, it seems like we're having some audio issues. I'm not able to hear it.
Betrayal.
Okay, I can hear it now.
Platform tonight to make a passionate plea to my beloved nation.
The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is the most celebrated leader of the Black struggle in America.
King is memorialized as this person who is all about peace and let's hold hands and get together. But
we've eliminated the more radical aspects of Martin Luther King Jr.'s critique.
The creation of an image into a version of heroism that is acceptable to the state, to the power source.
And I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghetto without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government.
April 4th, 1967, speech at Riverside Church.
In that last year of his life, King argued that the victories of the late 50s and the early 60s were cheap.
He had gone through changing legislation, and that was why he got the Voting Rights Act of 65. They achieved their initial goal.
Even Dr. King said that, it goes beyond the Voting Rights Act.
So the question for King was, what's next for him in this popular movement that he's leading?
Phase one was the struggle against segregation, against Jim Crow.
Started to trend away from just racial segregation and more towards their economic power structures.
True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring.
And so the Poor People's Campaign was to be phase two of this struggle to create a better America.
We have that King dismissed and erased.
But King is a figure whose real ideas and real legacy have been, to borrow a phrase, buried under a mountain of praise.
Given to us in a version who talked sort of emptily, vapidly about a dream.
So the challenge for us is to excavate, if you will, those real ideas and that real legacy.
That no one who has any concern for the integrity and life of America today can ignore the present war. They must see Americans as strange liberators. So far we have killed 1 million of them. I cannot be silent.
I think the most important fact of Dr. King's journey was his split with Lyndon Johnson over the war.
Johnson, at the time, flipped out in the Oval Office, screaming, "What is that goddamn nigger preacher doing to me?"
He was reviled and despised by white America, followed by the FBI, labeled a communist and anti-American.
Time magazine called King, quote, "a drawling bumpkin, so ignorant that he had not read a newspaper in years."
Dr. King broke with the most powerful man in the world. That split really described not just Dr. King's politics, but his courage and his character.
These are the times for real choices and not false ones. I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values.
It's really interesting to me how timeless he is. Timeless. What he was preaching back then is so very relevant today.
We don't get the kind of support that we deserve here while money is being spent, as we see now, the billions of dollars a day to oppress somebody overseas.
And it also tells us just how far we have not come.
So, every Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, we want to honor the real king.
The real king.
All the civil rights leaders, for various reasons, refuse or can't take a stand or have to go along with the administration. That's their business. But I must say tonight that I know that justice is indivisible. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice
everywhere.
Okay. All right. Peace, family. My name is, for those who may not know me, my name is Asafo Shaka Sekou. And we're going to do a very brief virtual presentation here about the radical politics of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I want to thank Geechee Motivator for setting this up for me and setting the PowerPoint up. Now, before we begin, I want to say that we are a part of a collective, a part of a group called the Barter and Build Think Tank. Those of you who are watching can see our logo in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. We are a think tank. We do a lot of work together. We have a study group where we study books and articles and documentaries or movies, and we think filter them through an African-centered perspective, and we bounce ideas off of each other and what have you. We're working on additional projects that we'll be talking more about coming up. So I want you all to, whenever you have the opportunity, look up Barter and Build Think Tank. We're on Facebook. We do have a YouTube channel. Again, that's Barter, BARTER, and Build Think Tank. Okay. So right now we're studying the book that we're studying now with our think tank is called On Organization. We have a study group every Monday at 7:30. So at this point, the book that we're studying is On Organization, Guiding Principles of Organization in a Period of African Renaissance by Dr. Kilimanjaro. Okay, so that's a side note. So Barter and Build Think Tank, like I said. So like I said, my name is Asafo Shaka Sekou, and we're going to talk about the radical legacy of Dr. King, the radical aspects of Dr. King, which has been thoroughly snuffed out through mainstream historiography and just society in general. We rarely get to hear anything in the way of Dr. King's critique of capitalism, Dr. King's critique of empire, Dr. King's critique of militarism, Dr. King's critique of materialism, and even Dr. King's critique of the petty black bourgeoisie. And he did critique all of those things. Hopefully, we'll be able to cover everything tonight. This we're going to try to get through this in about 40 minutes with about 20 minutes of Q&A. So this will be a rather condensed version of the presentation. For a broader lecture, maybe about a 2.5 hour lecture on this same subject, I posted a link in the chat on my publishing company's YouTube channel, which is discussing similar information, but it'll be longer and more protracted, more detailed. And I can only give you kind of like the cliff notes for this presentation. This information is based on the book, The Radical Legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. Political Study Guide by myself. I wrote this book a few years ago, and a lot of the information that you'll be hearing here is discussed in more detail in the book. I call it a book, but it's more of a study guide, like the title suggests. It's kind of a compilation, if you will, of information, data, resources that you could go and read about the real legacy of Dr. King. I'm doing a lot of quoting because I don't want people. A lot of us like to lean on personal opinion when it comes to someone like Dr. King, because Dr. King's legacy, Dr. King's politics have been so watered down, have been so denuded, have been so neutered that, you know, anyone can say anything about Dr. King. But I didn't want to lean on my own understanding, if you will, or lean on my own opinions. I wanted to lean on the opinions of the experts, the historians, Dr. King's own words, Dr. King's speeches, what he wrote in his books, and things like that. I wanted to lean heavily on things like that. So this is just not me saying this. This is this expert historian, or this is Dr. King himself saying these things. All right, so next slide. So the study guide. Why did I do the study guide? It's I wanted to start a conversation about the real legacy of Dr. King, like I said. Want to defend Dr. King from the fictitious Martin-Malcolm dichotomy as we were coming up and coming of age politically. Those Black folks who are, you know, have some semblance of political consciousness, we at one time or another, I think all of us have been hit with this, or had this dichotomy put to us, this bifurcation, if you will. Are you a Malcolm or are you a Martin? And what I want to do with this talk and with the other lectures I've done and with this study guide is kind of let people know and inform people that their politics actually merged and had parallel politics more than historiography likes to let us know, and more than we think. To take Dr. King back from the white oppressors of poor people and of poor people of color. Yeah, I wanted to again, like you saw in the video, Brian Jones, he made a comment saying that Dr. King has been, quote, buried under a mountain of praise. And it is our job to excavate, to get back to the excavate and push all that praise to the side and get back to the real Dr. King. You know, because we have anybody, no matter how reactionary, no matter how racist, no matter how imperialistic, no matter how capitalistic they are, they can prop up Dr. King as an example, or their admiration of Dr. King as an example of how they're all right, or they're not racist, or they're for the people, or whatever like that. Okay. And what we need to do is take Dr. King back and present an image of Dr. King that made those people fearful when he was alive. Okay. The King that exists now, the King that has been given to us now, is not the Dr. King that actually existed. It is our job to reveal the Dr. King and study and research and promulgate the legacy of Dr. King that struck fear in the hearts of the militarists, the capitalists, and the racists. Also, to take Dr. King back from the Black bourgeoisie. They're another segment a segment, if you will, or another group that has really used Dr. King to kind of justify their own cowardice, which brings me to the next point. So let's go on. This is my favorite quote from Dr. King, and I've titled this "Reclaiming Dr. King's Legacy," and I'll read it here in its entirety. I choose to identify with the underprivileged. I choose to identify with the poor. I choose to give my life for the hungry. I choose to give my life for those who have been left out of the sunlight of opportunity, seeing life as a long and desolate corridor with no exit sign. This is the way I'm going. If it means suffering a little bit, I'm going that way. If it means dying for them, I'm going that way. That's what Dr. King said in 1966. Okay. Next slide, please. These are what you're seeing now are books by Dr. King, books written by Dr. King. Dr. King wrote 5 books, and not many people really talk about the 5 books that Dr. King wrote. You have his autobiography, you have Strength to Love, you have Why We Can't Wait, and Measure of a Man, which is kind of the Measure of a Man is the smallest book out of all of these, but I think it's the most potent and poignant, because Measure of a Man is really as small as the book is, you could probably read it in one sitting. But as small as it is, it's probably the clearest depiction or the clearest articulation by Dr. King of his social and political belief system. And his last book before he was killed, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? And it's in Chaos or Community that we find Dr. King becoming much more radicalized and much more in line with, say, a Malcolm X type of figure. So there are 10 conclusions I reach in the study guide, and I'm going to go over these very quickly. Let me go through my notes here. Just bear with me one moment. So the first conclusion, I was going to read them out, but I can't find them all together. So I'll just go through the presentation, read them through the presentation. Conclusion number 1, the life and legacy of Dr. King and about almost everything the average person knows about him have been colonized and hijacked by white capitalist power. And we talked about Dr. King has been buried under a mountain of praise. And also, at the time when I was writing this study guide, it was around the time the monument was being finished up or unveiled. And I took a moment in the book to talk about the funders of this monument. Everyone from GM to Tommy Hilfiger to corporations involved in the military-industrial complex to just the most reactionary racist segments of the corporate sphere were giving money to fund the building of this monument. And that, more than anything else, should have proven to all of us at the time that that monument represents the final defeat of the real legacy of Dr. King. The burial of Dr. King under a mountain of praise. And we get so caught up in the how magnificent the monument is. We get so caught up in all of these people coming together in Pollyanna and holding hands and smiling at one another, and everyone's living the dream, that we often forget that Dr. King's politics are much more radical than would have been comfortable if Dr. King hadn't been so neutered, figuratively speaking. If the legacy of Dr. King hadn't been so neutered the way it was, none of these corporations would be giving money for a monument for Dr. King. And we have to understand that. And these corporations doing this was nothing more than a sign of good marketing, good branding. So they can do all of the criminal things that they do throughout the world, exploit people, lead to people's deaths with their weapons that they're creating, or exploit people in their sweatshops, or any number of things that these corporations are doing. We're supposed to ignore that and forgive them for that because they shoveled out some money for a monument. And the idea is supposed to be, when we come against them and tell them, let them know, that we're going to fight against them. No, look, I gave this money for Dr. King's monument. So we're good. So, and that's why they gave the money. That was the political purpose of why they gave the money. And we, need to understand that. So conclusion number 2, Dr. King believed in militant nonviolence as a tactical strategy, not as a way of life. Dr. King was in line with Malcolm X philosophically on the question of self-defense. And I've a couple of quotes here. Like I said, we're going to have to go through this rather quickly. I want to make sure we get through everything on time. So the first quote is from Where Do We Go From Here, page 27. And this is Dr. King writing now. I contended that the debate over the question of self-defense was unnecessary, since few people suggested that Negroes should not defend themselves as individuals when attacked. The question was not whether one should use a gun to defend his home when his home was attacked, but whether it was tactically wise to use a gun while participating in an organized demonstration. So what is he saying? Dr. King is not talking about nonviolence as a way of life. He's talking about nonviolence as a tactic. Okay. He's saying, of course, defend yourself if you're by yourself walking down the road and you're attacked by some racist whites, or if your home is attacked by the Klan or something. Of course, defend yourself. We're talking about when you're actually participating in a march, when you're participating in the demonstration. Okay. Quote B. I believe I would have probably temporarily sacrificed my pacifism because Hitler was such an evil force in history. I would willingly have fought against the Nazi menace of the 1940s. And that's from his speech in Beyond Vietnam in 1967. Okay, so we're seeing Dr. King being willing in certain circumstances to move away from nonviolence, a total, complete commitment to nonviolence when the situation called for it. So he's saying, I would have been violent. I would have not been nonviolent when it came to fighting against Hitler and the Nazis. Okay. All right. So conclusion number 3, Dr. King was a democratic socialist. All right. So we have people claiming Dr. King, say, oh, Dr. King would have had this mindset. Dr. King would have had that mindset. But let's actually look at what he wrote. If we want to know what Dr. King's politics were, let's look at what he actually wrote himself. Quote 1, I imagine this is a letter to his wife, Coretta Scott King, in 1952. I imagine you already know that I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic. Capitalism started out with a noble and high motive, but like most human systems, it fell victim to the very thing it was revolting against. Okay, so that's clear, cut, and dry. He's more socialistic than capitalistic. B, during staff retreats, Dr. King, this is a quote from Dr. James Cone's book, Malcolm and Martin. I have the book here. I'm holding it up to the camera so everyone can see it. Malcolm and Martin and America, A Dream or a Nightmare. Okay, he says the following. During staff retreats, Dr. King often requested that the tape recorders be switched off so he could express his views frankly and honestly about the need for a complete revolution in the American political economy, replacing capitalism with some form of socialism. Okay, that's a quote from Dr. James Cone in his book, Malcolm and Martin and America. All right. Dr. King and the SCLC supported Black Power not as a slogan, but as a program. Dr. King stated that ethnic groups such as Irish and Italians did not use slogans of Irish power or Italian power, but they worked hard to achieve power. King stated, this is exactly what we must do. We must use every constructive means to amass economic and political power. This is the kind of legitimate power we need. He added, but this must be done through a program, not merely a slogan. So what is Dr. King talking about? He's talking about Black Power, not just as a slogan where you're pumping your fists, you're holding your fists up to the air. We're talking about Black Power as an actual program. Okay, let me go through my notes here. I have more information in my notes, so I just want to make sure I want to cover everything, okay? Okay, so the next thing is Black control of the inner city. So this is a very important quote, one of my favorite quotes from Dr. King. And I want to make sure I find it here. Just give me one moment. Okay, here it is. So Dr. King said this, and this is quoted in Cone's book as well. Now this is Dr. King speaking. This is a quote from Dr. King. Now, I don't believe in separatism. I'm against it, but I do say this. It seems that our white brothers and sisters don't want to live next door to us. So they're pinning us in central cities. We're hemmed in. We can't get out. They won't pass a fair housing bill here. And that's true for every city in the country. Now, since they're just going to keep us here, what we're going to have to do is just control the central city. We've got to be mayors of these big cities. And the minute we get elected mayor, we've got to begin taxing everybody who works in the city but lives in the suburbs. I know this sounds mean, but I just want to be realistic. So Dr. King is talking about controlling the cities, controlling the inner cities, and making these cities black spaces and taxing all of the non-black people who come in and exploit the people and then take that money out of those cities back to the suburbs. Okay. So the next thing is Black is Beautiful. Larry, could you cue the Black is Beautiful video for me? So we have Dr. King's words himself saying this.
I come here tonight and plead with you. Believe in yourself and believe that you're somebody. I said to the group last night, nobody else can do this for us. No document can do this for us. No Lincolnian Emancipation Proclamation can do this for us. No Kennisonian or Johnsonian Civil Rights Bill can do this for us. If the Negro is to be free, he must move down into the inner resources of his own soul and sign with the pen and ink of self-assertive manhood his own emancipation proclamation. Don't let anybody take your manhood. Be proud of our heritage. As somebody said earlier tonight, we don't have anything to be ashamed of. Somebody told a lie one day. They couched it in language. They made everything black, ugly, and evil. Look in your dictionary and see the synonyms of the word black. It's always something degrading and low and sinister. Look at the word white. It's always something pure. But I want to get the language right tonight. I want to get the language so right that everybody here will cry out, yes, I'm black, I'm proud of it, I'm black and beautiful.
All right. All right, so I want to add to that. Another quote that he said here. Black is beautiful and as beautiful as any color. When we believe that, this is something very necessary. This is something very constructive and very creative. So the concept of Black power is something that we certainly are able to understand and accept. So as we talk about power, we must always see power as the right use of strength. Okay, that's another quote. So let's move on here. Growing suspicion of whites. So we had so during on Dr. King's the observation of Dr. King's birthday, I posted a lot of stuff in Facebook that many of you may have seen already, but I want to just give you a couple of quotes. See, a lot of this stuff is from Dr. King himself, or historians that did the research on Dr. King and knew about the legacy of Dr. King quite well. All right, so suspicion of whites. He says the following, and this is from his letter from Birmingham jail. I must confess that over the last few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion. Now, back then, the white moderate would be what we call today a white liberal, okay? I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who paternalistically feels he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. Another quote, I believe this was from a speech by Dr. King in Louisville, Kentucky in 1967. He says the following: I'm sorry to have to say this to you, that the vast majority of white Americans are racist, either consciously or unconsciously. Last quote, pre-March on Washington campaign, Laurel, Mississippi, 1968. The thing wrong with America is white racism. White folks are not right. Now, they've been making a lot of studies of the Negro, about the ghetto, about the slums. It's time for America to have an intensified study of what's wrong with white folk. Anybody that will go around bombing houses and churches, is something wrong with them. Okay? So you can see as King was, as the civil rights movement was going on and King was becoming more and more radical, he could see the contradictions. He was able to see the contradictions. King, I believe, was entering a period of time that I would suspect that Antonio Gramsci would call an interregnum, where Dr. King was really starting to see the contradictions and starting to see that the method, what we were asking for as far as civil rights legislation on the books wasn't necessarily it. It wasn't enough. And so so he was saying that we have to now become more and more radicalized. We have to expand our vision of what a just society or the beloved society would be. Okay. Dr. King's Pan-African work. We could talk about the Dr. King going to Ghana to be a guest of Asajefo Kwame Nkrumah as Nkrumah was being sworn in to become the leader of that nation. I have a lengthy quote here about Dr. King's Pan-Africanism. This is from Professor Manu Ampam in an article he did called Dr. King Supported Black Power. And this is a quote from Professor Ampam. He says the following: in the 1960s, Dr. King and other leaders called for the support of armed liberation struggles in Africa through two organizations, the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa and the American Committee on Africa. For example, King was a leading figure in the ANLCA, which was formed in 1962 to address the important issues of African Americans assuming a greater responsibility for the formation of U.S. policy in sub-Saharan Africa. It is in its first conference in November of 1962, that organization indicated in the preamble from the conference that the liberation struggle in Africa had reached a critical stage and that the organization rejoiced with those nations of Africa, quote, who had taken their place in the community of free nations, unquote. He was talking about Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria And keep in mind that all these nations had achieved their independence from France through armed struggle. Further in the conference revolution, this organization stated, quote, "We support the nationals of Angola and Mozambique in their struggle for freedom and independence." Also, I'm just kind of skipping down here. Also, in its September 1964 conference, this organization, the ANLCA, repeated its call for unconditional support of liberation movements in Africa, and that, quote, "every support," unquote, should be given to their attempts to achieve self-government in the Portuguese territories in Africa. Okay, so Dr. King was also developing a Pan-African consciousness as well, something that is completely left out. I would recommend, brothers and sisters, there's a book, I have it here, called A Single Garment of Destiny. An often overlooked aspect of Dr. King's political life was Dr. King's activities on the global stage. We talk about the domestic activities as a civil rights leader, but Dr. King was a global leader, and you would do well to read this book and learn more about Dr. King's work with African leaders, Dr. King's work with the third and fourth worlds, Dr. King's work, when it comes to the Buddhist leaders who were, finding a way to try to deal with the Vietnam War and trying to end the Vietnam War. Just a plethora of great things that you would learn from this book. Okay. Oh, and lastly on this page, an alliance with Malcolm X. This is another quote from the introduction to a book, one of my favorite books. Let me get it here, called The Radical King. This is a collection of his speeches and some writings. I'm holding it up to the camera. That reveal the radical king, as the title suggests. So this is from the introduction. The FBI transcript of June 27th, 1964, of a June 27, 1964 phone conversation reveals Malcolm X receiving a message from Martin Luther King Jr. This message supported the idea of getting a human rights declaration in the United States to expose the unfair, vicious treatment of Black people in America. Malcolm X replied that he was eager to meet Martin Luther King Jr. as soon as the next afternoon. So as we move to the next slide, can you imagine? I just want you to take a couple of seconds to imagine the United Nations, Dr. King and Malcolm X standing next to one another up on the dais, condemning the United States because of its treatment of Black people. Think about that. Do you know what kind of damage that would have done to the United States' reputation? So there was no way that they could have allowed that to happen. The FBI picked up on that wiretap, and that was then that they knew, yeah, we gotta break this up. We can't have them getting together. All right. So let's see here. Let's move on. Next slide. So conclusion number 5. Dr. King was seen as one of the most dangerous threats to the national security of the United States. The government of the United States saw Dr. King as a perpetual threat to the security of the United States and the economic interests of American corporations at home and abroad. Okay, you have to understand that corporations were benefiting from the Vietnam War. The war machine was being fueled and funneled and supplied by private corporations. So when Dr. King came out and spoke out against the war and was trying to help participate in a peace movement that would have ended the war, these corporations that were fueling the war machine, the American war machine, stood to lose a lot of money. So they could not allow that to happen. And it was after Dr. King, we're not even talking about later on when Dr. King condemned the war. We can even go back to after Dr. King made his "I Have a Dream" speech. After that speech was made, the FBI declared that Dr. King was the biggest threat to the internal security of the United States. They said that. And as lofty as the speech was, as lofty and Pollyannish as we now interpret that speech as, the FBI back then saw Dr. King as a threat. Okay. Okay, yeah, so let me read this quote here. God didn't call America to do what she's doing in the world now. God didn't call America to engage in a senseless, unjust war as the war in Vietnam. And we are criminals in that war. We have committed more war crimes almost than any nation in the world, and I'm going to continue to say it. And we don't stop it because of our pride and our arrogance as a nation. God has a way of even putting nations in their place. The God that I worship has a way of saying, don't play with me. He has a way of saying, as the God of the Old Testament used to say to the Hebrews, don't play with me, Israel. Don't play with me, Babylon. Be still and know that I am God. And if you do not stop your reckless course, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power. Okay, and that's from the Drum Major Instinct sermon, February 4th, 1968. Okay. So in part B there, we can talk about his work, Dr. King's work and alliance with Stanley Levinson, and how the federal government was using Stanley Levinson, who was formerly a communist, and had communist ties during the time he was working with Dr. King, tried to use that to say that Dr. King himself was a communist. Okay. So let's move on. Next slide, please. Okay, Dr. King was one of the most reviled public figures in America at the time of his death. Okay. So when Dr. King began placing the right focus on imperialism, placing the right focus on militarism, placing the right focus on capitalism, placing the right focus on racism, and not just focusing on, being a Southern civil rights, leader, and started looking at things from a global perspective, Dr. King became more and more hated. He became less of a beloved country preacher and civil rights leader and more of a reviled figure and the media played. You wouldn't imagine some of the things that the media said about Dr. King when he came out against the war. Quote, when King did speak out against the Vietnam War, the New York Times decried Dr. King's error, while congressional leaders and allies fiercely condemned him. That's from the book, All Labor Has Dignity by Professor Michael Honey. The New York Times, and we saw this in the video from Brian Jones, I'll read it again. The New York Times further called King a drawling bumpkin, so ignorant that he had not read a newspaper in years. The Washington Post stated in 1967 that he, King, had diminished his usefulness to his cause, his country, and his people. So I'm going to give for this part here, to wrap up this conclusion, I'm going to give you another quote from Dr. King. This is from a statement that Dr. King made that was printed in Playboy magazine in January of 19. Now this statement was printed, so this is printed in January 1969. This was after his death, so I'm assuming that this statement was put in the magazine posthumously. Okay, so he says, this is a quote from Dr. King: They, the media, applauded us in the sit-in movement when we nonviolently decided to sit at lunch counters. They applauded us on the freedom rides when we accepted blows without retaliation. They praised us in Birmingham and Selma, Alabama. Oh, the press was so noble in its applause and praise when I would say, be nonviolent toward Bull Connor, be nonviolent toward Jim Clark. There is something strangely inconsistent about a nation and a press that will praise you when you say, be nonviolent toward Jim Clark, but will curse you and damn you when you say, be nonviolent toward little brown Vietnamese children. Okay. Let's go on to the next slide. Dr. King was a fierce critic of the black middle class or the black bourgeoisie, among whom he found ferocious opposition. Okay, and so black bourgeoisie, I have that there because we talk about in the more extended version of this lecture, we kind of go into, the idea of the black bourgeoisie, what the black bourgeoisie is, E. Franklin Frazier's book, talking about the black bourgeoisie and what have you. But for the purposes of time in this particular lecture, I will just agree that the black bourgeoisie are people who, among our race, among black people, who see themselves as higher up because of a higher income. They will assume that they have higher wealth than the average black person, but that's not the case. We can look at the economic scholarship of Derek Hamilton and others, Sandy Darity and others, when they tell us that there's no such thing as a black middle class if class is determined by wealth. So the black bourgeoisie, they have some semblance of an advantage over the working class black folks based on income, not necessarily wealth. And because of that advantage they have due to income, they see themselves as a set apart from the rest of us. So in one speech, this is from Taylor Branch, his scholarship on Dr. King. In one speech, Dr. King criticized his own fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha, for spending more money on alcohol for their conventions than they donated to civil rights groups like the NAACP. Okay, and we're going to talk about conflicts with black leaders such as Adam Clayton Powell, Thurgood Marshall, Whitney Young, and Carl Rowan. Let's go to the next slide. So you see there the four people I just named. The upper left-hand corner is Carl Rowan. The upper right-hand corner is Adam Clayton Powell. The bottom left-hand corner is Thurgood Marshall, and the bottom right-hand corner is Whitney Young. So I want to, I really wish I could have had the quote from, especially Thurgood Marshall. You wouldn't believe some of the things that Thurgood Marshall, of all people, said about Dr. King. I'm trying to find it in my notes. Just bear with me a moment. Okay. Let me just read this. I can't find it. I don't want to waste time trying to look for it. But let me just read a couple of things here. Carl Rowan, a successful and influential journalist, criticized King. Can we go back to the previous slide with the pictures? Okay, so Carl Rowan in the upper left-hand corner there. Carl Rowan, a successful influential journalist, criticized King's opposition to the Vietnam War and was known for using his influence to convince black people during the 60s that their problems in the United States were solved. And that's Carl Rowan. Okay. Whitney Young, leader of the NAACP, and Roy Wilkins of the Urban League, I think I might have that mixed up, criticized King for attacking Johnson who in their eyes was the best president the black man ever had. Another quote. Now this quote is from the second an article from Harper's Magazine called "The Second Coming of Martin Luther King Jr." by David Halberstam. This quote I'm about to read now. Many blacks in the civil rights movement, including some in the SCLC staff, joined the chorus of criticism against King's views on Vietnam. For example, when Whitney Young of the Urban League cornered King in public and reprimanded him about his views on Vietnam, King responded sharply with the following, quote, "Whitney, what you're saying may get you a foundation grant, but it won't get you into the kingdom of truth," unquote. And I'll go back to Thurgood Marshall really quickly. He said, as a civil rights leader, that Dr. King wasn't worth shit. And he actually said shit, wasn't worth shit, and said that Dr. King was, quote, "a boy on a man's errand." He was a boy on a man's errand. Now, I think a lot of that was from the fact that the SCLC would do a lot of the nonviolent, civil disobedience and get locked up and then go, and then they would have to rely on the NAACP for legal defense and everything. So I think Thurgood Marshall was very critical of Dr. King getting himself locked up and then coming, and getting him and his people locked up and then coming to the NAACP for defense and help. So I think that was a part of it too. All right, so let's move on. All right, so this is a lengthy quote. I have to read it because this is a stinging critique of the black middle class. But now this is from Where Do We Go From Here? His last book, I believe. I have to look for the page number, but this is from his last book. But many middle-class Negroes have forgotten their roots and are more concerned about conspicuous consumption than about the cause of justice. Instead, they seek to sit in some serene and passionless realm of isolation, untouched and unmoved by the agonies and struggles of their underprivileged brothers. This kind of selfish detachment has caused the masses of Negroes to feel alienated, not only from white society, but also from the Negro middle class. They feel that the average middle-class Negro has no concern for their plight. The feeling is often corroborated by the hard facts of experience. How many Negroes who have achieved educational and economic security have forgotten that they are where they are because of the support of faceless, unlettered, and unheralded Negroes who did ordinary jobs in an extraordinary way? How many successful Negroes have forgotten that uneducated and poverty-stricken mothers and fathers often worked until their eyebrows were scorched and their hands bruised so that their children could get an education? For the middle-class Negro to forget the masses is an act not only of neglect, but of shameful ingratitude. Next slide, please. Okay. Dr. King saw the gains of the Civil Rights Movement and Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act as cheap victories and moved to the fight for radical redistribution of political and economic power. So for this, I'll only read one quote. This is from his last book, Where Do We Go From Here, pages 5 through 6. It's a lengthy quote. You see it there, but it's very important that I read this. He says, "The practical cost of change for the nation up to this point has been cheap. The limited reforms have been obtained at bargain rates. There are no expenses and no taxes are required for Negroes to share lunch counters, libraries, parks, hotels, and other facilities with whites. Even the psychological adjustment is far from formidable. Having exaggerated the emotional difficulties for decades, when demands for new conduct became inescapable, white Southerners may have trembled under the strain, but they did not collapse. Even the more significant changes involved in voter registration required neither large monetary nor psychological sacrifice. spectacular and turbulent events that dramatized the demand created an erroneous impression that a heavy burden was involved. So real quick, let me stop there. And we're running out of time, but I have to say this. That quote, that sentence, spectacular and turbulent events that dramatized the demand created an erroneous impression that a heavy burden was involved. That's Dr. King in 1967, 68, saying and telling us that when someone comes to you and said, "Oh, our people died for the right to vote. We did this, we did that. We need to vote because our ancestors died for the right to vote." Dr. King back then was saying, "Yeah, we went through a lot to get that right, but that was a cheap victory. That wasn't something that we need to rest on or rest our laurels on or just see." We get that, and then we walk away and declare victory. And the battle's over. We can vote now. Dr. King didn't say that. Let me move on. The real cost lies ahead. The stiffening of white resistance is recognition of this fact. The discount education given Negroes will in the future have to be purchased at full price if quality education is to be realized. And this is where he gets really bold. Jobs are harder and costlier to create than voting rolls. The eradication of slums housing millions is complex far beyond integrating buses and lunch counters. Okay, so we'll leave it at that. Let's move on. So this is the one that's this conclusion gets me in a lot of trouble with people. All the documented evidence proves that Dr. King would have been a severe opponent of President Barack Obama and probably would have been jailed or assassinated during Obama's presidency. Okay. Now, in this section, let's move on to the next slide. So in this section, what I do in the longer form of this lecture is compare the Nobel lectures. So one thing that these two men, Obama and Dr. King, have in common is that they both won the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, if you read Dr. King's Nobel Prize lecture and compare it with Barack Obama's Nobel Prize lecture, you get radically different ideals of what the world should look like. Okay? From Barack Obama, you get an ideal based on what he would call just war. Okay. And we have to realpolitik, if you will, to a certain extent. This idea, well, we have to be realistic. The world, we have to accept the world as it is. There are forces in the world that are against America, and we have to do whatever we can to suppress those forces and da-da-da-da-da. Okay. But with Dr. King, he's saying, no, the world is what it is. That's fine, whatever. But we need to be struggling and fighting for a better world. Okay. And you're not going to struggle and fight for that better world. The medium that you're going to create that better world is not going to be through war. Okay. Let's move on to the next slide. So those are the two, I'm comparing the two speeches, excerpts from the two speeches. Let's go on. So, and I don't have enough time to get it. We'll have to kind of skip over this stuff. But Dr. King called the evil triplets racism, militarism, and capitalism, or extreme materialism. But militarism and capitalism. These were the three evil triplets that Dr. King said that we should be declaring eternal hostility against as people of good conscience. And I go through the slides here. Racism, let's go to the next slide. I go through these slides here talking about Barack Obama's involvement or promulgation or things that he did that didn't roll back these three evil triplets, but contributed to these evil triplets and further legitimize the evil triplets. So let's go to the next slide. maybe we can cover this a little bit in the Q&A if someone's interested. Let's move on. All right, so conclusion number 10. Dr. King and the SCLC's nascent Poor People's Campaign was the precursor to the modern Occupy Wall Street movement and Black Lives Matter. So what I wanted to do with this aspect of it is connect and draw a line from what's happening in more contemporary movements. Like today we have Black Lives Matter. A few years ago, we had the Occupy movement. I wanted to take those two movements. When with Occupy, you're dealing with class. With Black Lives Matter, you're dealing with the intersection of class and race. And many people have taken it as almost axiomatic that these movements are a step down from what Dr. King and the SCLC were doing back then. What I do is I try to use Dr. King's own words and use the documentation to say that we can draw a direct line from the Poor People's Campaign, the methods and tactics that were used, and connect them to what's being done with Occupy a few years ago and Black Lives Matter today. Okay. So some of the tactics of the Poor People's Campaign were to have poor people build a shanty town on government property, which they did, which was called Resurrection City. Have delegations of poor people lobby congressional committees, individual congressmen, and agencies. So poor people would be going around Washington, reaching out to the Congress people and getting them to support Poor People's Bill of Rights, which was the main goal of this movement. HEW and Department of Agriculture would be targets of sit-ins. So they would sit in at these departments. Sick people from all over the country would come in and jam the hospital waiting rooms and sit in the hospital waiting rooms as kind of a protest for kind of a precursor to what we would call Medicare for All today. That's what they were protesting. That's what they would be protesting for. Have school children boycott their classes and picket the Board of Education, and organize the dumping of trash. They're going to take trash from the ghettos of America and dump them on the steps of the Capitol. Okay. So a few points on Dr. King's assassination. I go over the Poor People's Campaign and Dr. King's assassination. I have another lecture that I do focused on just those two things. So maybe somewhere down the line, we'll cover that as well. Now, this information comes from a man by the name of William Pepper, who was a confidant of Dr. King that last year of Dr. King's life, and who wrote 2 books on the King assassination called An Act of State and Orders to Kill. And he gives very detailed information and documentation about the King assassination and how it was not done by a lone sniper named James Earl Ray, but it was done by a conspiracy organized by the FBI. Dr. King, this according to Pepper. Now, Dr. King was not murdered by James Earl Ray. He was killed by a city of Memphis police officer who was a trained sniper. There was a team of military snipers hiding across the street from the Lorraine Motel with orders to kill Dr. King and Andrew Young. Unknown to the team, they were acting as a backup team in case the police sniper missed. The police officer who shot King was instructed to pass the rifle to Lloyd Jowers, who was paid to hide the weapon and eventually dispose of it. King was murdered because of his opposition to Vietnam, fear of him aligning with the Black Power movement, and the Poor People's Campaign. There is strong evidence that suggests Jesse Jackson and Billy Cowles were involved in the assassination plot. Okay, I would love to get more into that, but we'll have to we'll have to discuss that at a later time. On the assassination, so I want to just kind of summarize what's up here. What happened was that we call O.J. Simpson's trial the trial of the century, but what was going on around that time was a civil lawsuit against the U.S. government and the city of Memphis for King's killing. So it says here, I'll read this bottom point. After the death of James Earl Ray, the King family filed a civil suit against Lloyd Jowers. The trial lasted 30 days with 70 witnesses, and after a 59-minute deliberation, Jowers was found guilty and liable for 30% of the damages, while the other 70% was on the agents of the city, the state, and the federal governments. This should have been blown up on every TV in America, but very few people heard about it because everyone was caught up in the OJ trial at the time. All right, let's move on. So I add another conclusion. If Dr. King were alive today, he would most definitely conclude that the oppression of Black people today is just as vicious as it was in the 1950s and the 1960s. We could talk about the pervasiveness of economic stagnation in the Black community. We could cover that more in the Q&A. The movement from slavery to Jim Crow segregation to the rise of the ghetto, and finally the implementation of mass incarceration, or the hyper ghetto. The resegregation of public schools to the level in 1968, and the rise of violence and terrorism against Black people. There's one just real quick point on that last that number 4 right there. The Malcolm X grassroots movement, they did research. This was years ago, and they found that a Black person was killed by a police officer, a security guard, or a self-appointed vigilante every 28 hours in this country. Every 28 hours in this country. Okay? The extrajudicial killing of Black people occurs every 28 hours. Now, the Washington Post came along a while later and said that the numbers were off, that they looked at a differing set of numbers, and they found that it's not 28 hours, every 28 hours. They said it's twice every 24 hours. So they did the research with all their resources and what have you, and they found that Black people are actually 2 Black people a day are being killed. Okay? So let's so if Dr. King came back, I'm making the point, Dr. King came back, he would conclude that it's just as bad today as it was when back then. Let's go on to the next slide. Where do we go from here? We can talk more about that probably in the Q&A. We need radical working class organization. And we need to avoid some of the pitfalls and contradictions, such as the politics of respectability. Or if we all just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and pull our pants up and get the right education and get the right degree and cut our hair and wear suits all the damn time, everything will be fine. What are you talking about? You know, there's more than enough evidence, economic data, that proves that no matter how respectable you carry yourself, or how much, or no matter how much we collectively adopt a politics of respectability, it doesn't change the Black and white wealth gap and the economic stagnation in our communities. There's an overemphasis on electoral politics. We see voting as the only means of getting any type of power. And of course, bourgeois intellectualism. We have too many public intellectuals who are parading themselves around when they're nothing more than armchair revolutionaries and sit in the ebony tower or ivory towers, the universities of this country, and lecture the Black people in the street about what we need to be doing. So we have to do away with, we're going to have to get out of having the Black bourgeoisie as our leadership altogether. We should not accept them as our leadership. If they want to be members of our working class organizing efforts, that we can debate that, but they shouldn't be the leaders. what we as working class Black people do should be based on our own self-interest, not what's going to benefit a handful of Black bougie Negroes, but what's going to benefit the masses of Black people. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so that's pretty much the end of it. Like I said, we had to kind of rush through it. I give a more detailed lecture on our YouTube channel. So if anyone in the chat has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
All right, brother. Thank you for the powerful, timely lecture. We have a bunch of comments in the session. What we will do is get to the questions, and then as you're answering those questions, if there are more questions, they can answer them. You kind of already answered this one, but John Adam asks, so Dr. King would be a Democrat today? What's your thoughts on that?
I think Dr. King would have seriously been critical of both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. The Republican Party for obvious reasons, but more so the Democratic Party, because we as Black people and working people in general, I think we give the Democratic Party way too much credit than they actually deserve. And we do this because for obvious reason. We do this because they call themselves the Big Tent. They have more Black faces among the leading members of their party, and we because of that, we think that because of their tolerance of Black people, their tolerance of Latinx people, their tolerance of poor people, their tolerance of working class people, we assume that they're working in the interest of those factions when they're really not. And I think Dr. King would today be pushing those factions, those groups, the marginalized, the oppressed, the poor, to not only rebel against the Republican Party, but also rebel against the Democratic Party.
So tell me this. Obviously, we don't have to go into certain policies, but we know Trump was saying a lot of things. He was tweeting a lot of things, and he's just been being a lot of things. Do you think Trump will be in agreement? Martin Luther King will be in agreement with anything Trump has done, said, or is?
No. That's, and again, I would be presumptuous. Let me just say at the outset, there's no way that I would know what Dr. King would think in a contemporary context. I don't want to be that guy to say, I speak for Dr. King or I know Dr. King would have done this. All we have are his documentation. All we have are his books and his speeches. All we have are the conclusions that he reached himself back then in 1968 and prior to that. And all we can do is put those things that he said, those things that he wrote, those things that he did in a contemporary context. So if you're talking about Dr. King back then saying that the evil triplets are racism, militarism, and capitalism, we have no other choice but to conclude that today Dr. King would be fighting against the people who benefit the most from racism, militarism, and capitalism, which is both the Republican and the Democratic Party, and which is and Trump personifies racism, militarism, and capitalism. He's a personification of those three things. So I have no other choice but to conclude that Dr. King would be fighting against a Trump-like figure.
Right. So as you know, and as I know, I think a few years ago you made me shift a little bit on MLK. And so there's people who are saying, wow, I've never heard these things before, so on and so forth. So you're dropping some interesting perspectives. What's one thing, and this is my question from that statement, what's one thing that you believed about him before you started doing a deep dive in, and that you was corrected quickly once you started studying?
Well, in answering that, the one person I have to thank, and I don't know if he'll ever see this, but there's a brother named, and I mentioned him during the presentation, named Brother Manu Ampam. I came across an article that he had written years ago called Dr. King. The name of the article was Dr. King Supported Black Power. I was like, because I was in the dichotomy, I was like, oh, well, forget Dr. King. I'm more of a Malcolm X type of guy and all like that. And that's what I assumed before. And, you know, as I read this article, Dr. Manu Ampam really inspired me to kind of dig deeper into this and learn more about Dr. King's radical politics. And so that would be the answer to my question. I felt like many others that Dr. King was just not radical enough for my liking.
Right.
But again, to my astonishment, I found out that the reason I felt that way was the pervasiveness of propaganda and historiography that has a very distinct interest in keeping the radical king out of the minds of the people.
Right. So tell me this. Quite often we'll hear that, oh, I led my people into a burning building, burning house, burning bush, whatever the hell we want to call it, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of people like, well, he got more radical at the end. So one of his questions was some of those quotes in his last years? And the add to that question is, in the beginning, were there things that we heard that was misinterpreted and he was actually radical in the beginning as well, or he was actually militant in the beginning as well?
Yeah. So like I said, I gave one quote. There's a lot more in the study guide and a lot more in the longer lecture. But we can go back all the way back. We can go all the way back to 1952. Like I talked about in the presentation here, with his letter to his wife, where he talks about I'm more socialistic than capitalistic. You know, and you can't get clearer than that. You know, and he said that, you know, capitalism had good intentions, but it's no longer useful. We have to change it to a more equitable system. So, you know, of course, we have in his last year, we have where do we go from here, chaos or community? We have his participation in the peace movement. We have his work to develop the new left in that last year. We have his work to become more militant and form alliances with more radical factions of the Black Power movement, what have you. So, yeah, you know, a lot of this is, you know, that we can glean from his last year, that he was becoming more and more radical. But his radicalism goes all the way back further than 1968, right. 1967.
Okay, so this next question, you know, me and you personally talked about Julius Malema and the EFF and some of the movements that's moving right now. Bobby Wine right now is being confined in his home in Africa. So the question is, does Black American need a new party like the EFF in South Africa?
I take the perspective of Dr. Amos Wilson on this. I think the short answer to the question is yes. I do believe Black people need to form their own political party. Okay. But along with that, like Amos Wilson said in Blueprint for Black Power, it's highly unlikely that any candidate that we would run for national office, like president, or maybe even, you know, in the Congress or what have you, may not get the amount of votes. It depends on where they're running, what location they're running to represent. So it would be dependent on that. So we more than likely probably wouldn't win a lot of elections at the beginning. But what we can do, and I think we should focus more on, is more of an educational project, a project of political education. We want to recruit more and more people to join the political party. And we want to be able to step to the two parties, Republican and Democrat, and to a lesser extent, Green Party. We say, look, this is our constituency. This is the number of people we represent. And out of these millions and millions of Black people that we represent, we want this, 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 and this. You give it to us. You promise it and guarantee it to us. We throw our party to support you. You don't give it to us. We throw our party to oppose you. And that's how we have to look at it from that perspective. You know, until we're able to build ourselves up with the masses of people and hopefully the funding in order to be able to run candidates on a national level.
Got it. Great answer. So as we are wrapping up, make sure you get your questions in. Everybody, thank you all for watching. Thank you for participating. Get your questions in as my brother wrap up this powerful lecture in the Q&A session. So another question from the group. Do we have any present day contemporaries to the radical politics of Dr. King, whether public or behind the scenes of the current Black liberation struggle? And while you're answering that, I'm going to throw in how you feel about a certain candidate that I've seen rocking out a little bit. It's a sister named Corey, but go ahead and answer that question, then tell me what you think about her.
Well, I think William Barber has the potential. I think William Barber, and I say this because he is carrying on the Poor People's Campaign, and Barber and the lady he's working with, Liz Theo Harris. But I think they're moving now. I can tell that they're moving now to try to co-opt William Barber. I'm seeing that he's being given these invitations to appear more and more frequently on MSNBC and MSNBC, a lesser extent CNN. And I think they're kind of trying to make him more mainstream. And I hope he's politically literate, not to sound presumptuous or insulting or condescending to him, but I hope that I hope his vision is clear enough to see what's happening and avoid it. And so a brother like that, I think he would be, depending on what direction he goes into. I hope he goes into a more radical direction, but I see him as an heir apparent type of guy, a public leader when it comes to someone taking up the mantle.
Okay. There's a sister, what's her name? Corey something. She's I'm trying to get her name.
Corey Bush.
A sister, right?
Yeah.
What do you think about her? I've heard some some cute and interesting and she looked like she gonna work. I mean, I know she's gonna. To me, she seems like she's working more than the Black woman who saved the world the other day. But what do you think about Corey Bush? Her movement and activity so far?
I think she's more courageous than probably any other member of the squad. I think because of her background and where she came from, she's staunchly working class. Someone who dealt a lot with poverty, someone who dealt a lot with being homeless, someone who dealt a lot with a lot of things that Black people deal with on a daily basis here in the hells of North America. And I think because she's coming to politics from that perspective, I think she'll go a lot further, more in the way of helping Black people than probably most other folks in politics would. So, but again, that remains to be seen. You know, we many of us had high hopes for, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I never had high hopes for her. I knew she was on the take from the door, but a lot of us had high hopes for her, and we see where that ended up. But
right.
But Corey Bush, to a lesser extent, Rashida Tlaib. I think those two would go a long way to helping working class Black people.
All right. Any more questions, my good people? One of the people who looked like they was texting and say they wanted to either ask questions or that they wanted to come on. I don't know the type of questions, but I know he said he wanted to talk directly. A brother from Minneapolis. How do you feel? You want to invite him on and see if you want to chat?
What's his name?
His name is James Badu L. It's a younger brother that I know. He's been doing a couple stuff in Minneapolis, and I know he was really instrumental for some of the times when when those white protesters was tearing up stuff. He was kind of like vocal down there, but that's if you want to. But anybody else got any questions in the comment section? Definitely come in, and then we'll see what Asaka wants to do as we wrap it up.
Well, we're unfortunately, I just, I think we're at the point now where we just need to conclude that it's just impossible for either one of us to just limit talking to 1 hour.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I do need to go pick up my son, so I need to, I will give you a few more minutes for questions.
All right. So I'll see if he can just come in and comment a question.
Okay.
Sometimes I think it's interesting, like when people they want to just jump on the camera, but I know we in a social media where it's kind of like real time, right? Back in the days, you want to call and come on, comment, and then sometimes I want to jump on the video.
Which in any other situation, I would be fine with it. I've never been one to not invite someone to come on and talk. I'm good with that. But it's more of a time issue with me at this point.
Yeah.
Because I'll need to.
Quasi said, great dialogue, and too bad there's no memes available to express my gratitude. Quasi said he's gonna stop talking. He's just gonna type memes in from now on. I use memes too now. It seems more effective in these days.
That's the new language.
Right. Yeah, new language, definitely. Any other questions? Great questions, by the way. Cool. For one, I appreciate this, brother. How does he feel about going past civil rights and raising the plight of human rights?
Yeah, that's something that we have always needed to focus on, moving beyond civil rights. And I think Dr. King was becoming more in line with Malcolm X on that point. And like I said, there's plenty of documentation to show that Dr. King was thinking on a global level of global issue of human rights, and not just relegating himself to being, this civil rights movement in America, in the American South. But definitely we need to build a movement. I'm a Pan-Africanist. I believe in Pan-Africanism, but I also believe that once Black people get themselves, it's once we get ourselves to the point where we're organized and we have our stuff together, as far as organization is concerned, and that's kind of what I'm saying. I'm purposefully making it vague because I don't even know what that would represent, what that would mean, on a global scale. But once we get ourselves together, I'm of the opinion that there are other groups that we could form coalitions with. Groups like in Asia, like Southeast Asia and South America and other places, that we could form coalitions with them to do a global attack on white supremacy, a global attack on global capitalism, a global attack on the ecological devastation that's being wrought by the corporatocracy and what have you. Now we're forming alliances with these groups. We're not getting married. I'm not talking about all Pollyanna, we hold hands. We're forming alliances for a specific purpose. And as long as we're the interests of African people globally are being met, those alliances will remain. When those alliances are inhibiting or disrupting the interests of African people, those alliances need to be severed. It's just that simple. I agree, as horrible a person as Henry Kissinger was, one thing I will always respect him saying is that we don't have permanent allies or friends. We only have permanent interests. And as long as those alliances benefit Black people, we will keep them. When they no longer benefit Black people, we sever them. That's it. That's it.
Yeah, I think just because we're not used to thinking politically, moving politically, and doing any political activity other than casting a vote, we don't really know how to deal with traitors, and we also don't know how to move in the interests best for Black folks. So that's a powerful thought. Let's see, this is a question. No human rights distract us from the Pan-African agenda. That move towards humanism is a result of socialism, sympathetic, solidarity, distractions. First, capitalism would. What do you think about that? Like going towards this kind of humanism will, like, you know, fighting other people's fights instead of dealing with what we are dealing with.
Well, I think that some certain things if we're talking about fighting global capitalism, you're going to have to form coalitions for that. Okay. You know, when it comes to fighting against climate change, which is an existential threat to the planet, you know, when it comes to nuclear weapons proliferation, these things that are existential threats to the planet, I think number one, we don't have any other choice, and number two, we have to, you know, think on the level of building coalitions that can effectively dismantle those structures. Okay. Yeah. And like I said, I'm in agreement that, you know, Pan-Africanism or perish, that has to be at the forefront. That has to be the main priority. But when it comes to things that are, you know, threats to the existential threats, that those coalitions have to be built. We cannot tackle those things on our own.
Yeah, although I know that, you know, in the protracted struggle, there's things, and we should have theory and ideology, and we should have foresight. Seems like sometimes we get ahead of ourselves with, like, oh, allyship, and it's like, yo, we ain't even got the allyship among ourselves yet. The Pan-Africanism is just a theory. It's not something that's tangible at this point. And so I feel like sometimes we get ahead of ourselves with that, especially in this concept of nation building. So the brother wants to connect and build with you. He created a rights organization for us as a people called the People's Right to Obtain Our Freedom Proof. And so he definitely wants to reach out to you. I think he's commenting through the comment section. So, I mean, to my text message. So I have to add it in there. Cool. Any other questions or thoughts? Great discussion. Great dialogue. Maybe that's why he wanted to talk, because he's having to text it instead of commenting.
Yeah, what we can do, perhaps that brother would be interested in coming to a think tank meeting on Mondays.
Yeah. I think he can see it. I don't know if he can comment, but all movements deal in human rights. Pan-Africanism is byproduct of that. Having the human rights to have collaborative economics is a tool for us and a direct fight against capitalism. Yeah. So yeah,
that's, you know, again, like I said, there's nothing that he said there that I would disagree with. I don't think, unless I didn't hear it right, I don't think that's necessarily contradicting anything that I said, right, unless I'm misinterpreting it.
Yeah,
I'm inclined to agree with the brother.
I think what it sounds like, he's more challenging what Black Meaning African said, because Black Meaning African said, no human rights distract us from Pan-Africanist agenda. That move towards humanism is a result of socialism. Yeah, so maybe he's saying,
okay.
Yeah, so would you agree with the brother, and you will disagree kind of with Black Meaning Africa? Is that what you're saying?
Well, what I'm saying is, I think is not. Maybe I'm misinterpreting it as an either or with black meaning African, that either we do this or do that. What I'm saying is both and. We do this, then we do that. You know.
Right. Yeah. Maybe I hope, you know, and that's the thing.
Or we do this, and in certain occasions we do that. For certain situations we do that.
Yeah. See, but that's the thing though. Like you remember
forming alliances outside of African people is not a fundamental part of our program. Okay. It's a side thing. It's like I said, we're building coalitions. But the coalition can only be effective if we're entering that coalition as a unified people. So Pan-Africanism must be the priority. It must be first.
Right. That you have to have some kind of strength and something to negotiate with before you start to do all that damn negotiating. I forgot what I was about to say. Oh yeah, I think we're in multiple spaces together. Like when we're having these conversations, like the and or the or is a big ass struggle for people. They hear or, and people was clearly saying and, but it's like that emotional connection to some ideological thing has them focus on the damn or. And so I'm glad you said that. All right, I think the brother has any more messages. That should be it. I think he was just pretty much some flowers about your energy. Now everybody gonna be calling me and stuff. See, man, you don't got things popping over here. He said, "This brother is bright, and I would be honored to join on Mondays. Thanks for standing up." Yeah, definitely, man. Yeah, absolutely. You're definitely invited to our think tank group. We'll share with you what we are reading and studying. We got a special guest this week coming up, so one of the authors from the book is definitely gonna be there.
Let me hold the book up again, just for everyone to know. On organization.
Yeah.
Okay.
Powerful book by the University of Kemet Press. Bunch of super brothers out there and sisters. I'm sorry, super sisters and brothers who published so many books. That's gonna definitely get us in the right direction.
So let me just say that in my past, I've read a lot of books, and I've done a lot of studying and research, and I'm not trying to be presumptuous like I'm that dude or anything, but I have to be honest, no offense to them, I would come across these books, I would come across Dr. Kilimanjaro's work, and I would kind of okay, well, that seems interesting, but that John Henrik Clarke though is right there, so I think for now I'm gonna just put this back and get that John Henrik Clarke, so
yeah.
So I would, but this is my first time coming across, these folks' work, and I'm impressed with the writing. I think On Organization is a very serious book so far, and is not to be taken lightly at all. And I look forward to dialoguing with the brother when he comes to the group meeting on Monday.
Absolutely. Any final words of wrap up, brother, as we let you get to your son, and we appreciate your time and this thrust, man. It was powerful.
Yeah, I'll say that I'll show my appreciation to you, brother, for the work you're doing. I want to shout out to everyone in the Barter and Build think tank. I want to thank everyone who viewed the presentation. You can reach out to me. I'm on social media on Safo Shaka Sekou. If you have any questions or additional comments, feel free to reach out. I'm always available. All right. So with that said, I thank you everyone for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.